We often hear that diversity, equity, and inclusion matters to businesses, but their data tells a different story. So what is the missing piece? On Finding Diversity, we tell real stories of what has worked for others and provide experiences that will inspire you. I'm Justus Thompson, and this is where our journey begins. Welcome back to Finding Diversity, the Missing Piece. Today, we're honored to have Rachel Kargas as an accomplished talent acquisition leader with over 25 years of experience across diverse industries. As a director of talent acquisitions and founder of Rachel Kargas Consulting LLC, Rachel has a proven track record in building and scaling teams, developing recruiting strategies, and promoting diversity and inclusion. I'm your host, Justus Thompson, and in this episode, Rachel will share her insights on strategic talent acquisition, inclusive culture, and effective recruiting practices. Let's get started. Well, as always, I don't know if you've seen any of their episodes, but we like starting with this really weird exercise we call Cape You. So it's one thing about your younger self, one thing about your culture, or something unique about you. You can share one story about any of these or all three. I will go ahead and kick us off. Something that's top of mind for me is weddings. I was actually just at one of my best friends' weddings. He just got married this last week, which was a lot of fun. It was a privilege to be at. But that's something that I really enjoy, is kind of the celebration of marriage and the union of two people. It was just nice to be able there. And I was lucky enough to serve in the role of a best man. And I just thought, the things around that of sharing and answering questions, of just the fear that comes with like making that next step and being really vulnerable, I really, really liked. And it was something that, I really value about our culture, and I think is fantastic. And with that said, I'll pass it over to you.
Well, I love weddings too. So congratulations on that. I want to talk about my culture, because that gave me pause for a long time. I really didn't know what my culture was. Mm-hmm. I grew up with, people who are Italian, Korean, German, and they would eat special foods and they would talk about the country. And all I'd ever heard of was some vague Eastern European place where our people came from. And what I found was my identity was much more, I was raised as a Jew, but not a religious person. More, I like to describe myself as a bagel and lox Jew. So there's a lot of room in Judaism for kind of that secular cultural belonging. And it took me a while to identify that, okay, I may not relate to a place in the world, but I relate to a community and a people, and that in the traditions and the food and the bagel and lox and the music of the Jewish people. So it took me a while to get there, but that's how I identify.
Rachel, I love that story. I think I resonate with what you just shared a lot. Being someone who's mixed, who's black and white, I think I had a lot of that too, where I didn't feel black enough for the black folks, didn't feel white enough for the white folks, and really recently have stepped much into like, it is what it is to me, and I get to be a part of this larger community, which is fantastic, but I don't have to conform to that community in order to feel like it lessens, for me, my blackness, which I love you sharing that. I really appreciate that.
Well, and I think it's not that unique for Jewish people, because I think of a lot of us don't necessarily identify with a part of the world simply because of the adversity and the struggles that we experienced in different parts of the world. So it's more about the community as opposed to the country or the nationality.
Yeah, that's such a good point. So I want to jump in to a really great question for you, which is you recently did a post. This will be going out far past when that post went out, but it seems like it's something everyone is really, really curious about. Talk about age discrimination for our viewers, what that is and how it shows up in the workplace.
Yeah. Well, I feel like it's the least talked about ism. We talk a lot about gender diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, the LGBTQ community, but we don't talk about ageism. It's actually very accepted. We make a lot of offhanded jokes. I make them about myself.
Yeah.
And I come from the tech space where the industry skews very young. In one of the last organizations that I worked for, people 50 and above made up less than 2% of the entire 3,500 person company. So you feel like you really don't belong. And there is, when you look at the ERG groups inside of organizations, there's usually not one for that 40 and above demographic. And there's not a lot of focus played on that. But it is very real. It came to me because I was on TikTok and I saw a lot of content around how to hide your age on your resume. Not to come across as too experienced. So shave off 10 years. Don't put your graduation date on. And I understand in the context of our society why that's important for people who simply need to land a job. But I think it's time that we start challenging those beliefs that as people are living longer, we continue to have so much to contribute to an organization, and organizations that have a wide diversity of generations, of ages, are going to have more diversity of thought and experience. And it's time for us to really start valuing the experience that comes with age.
Yeah, I do think that's such a great point, that we tend to think of implicit bias as this nefarious thing that exists in the ether, and oftentimes fail to connect it to the practical side of it happens and it shows up, and we don't realize how we conform to people's implicit biases. That's why we do resume redaction, or we change our resume to make it seem like maybe we're less than, or we don't have as much experience, or we leave our last name off if it's a Black last name, and we never really address the actual bias. And I feel like this is what you're getting at, right? Which is the bias is really the recruiter, the person who's actually hiring that person, or the hiring manager who's making those decisions. And that's who should really have the onus for this, right? You should be able to show up with all your plethora of experience, whether it be age, or with your last name, if it happens to be Black, or your first name, right? And not have those things counted against you. So I love that thought. I think it's so important for our listeners to take away.
Yeah. And I think with age, again, I do feel there's a lot of conversation around other demographics, other sort of protected or marginalized communities, which is great. And the problem's not solved by any means, but we don't talk about that as much when it comes to age. And we do all kinds of things to hide our age in our day-to-day lives outside of the workplace. We get Botox, we get our hair color, and, we do things because we are afraid of what it means to be older. We have a lot of negative stereotypes and biases about older or more mature workers. They don't know technology. They don't have the energy to keep up with the fast pace of work. They're stuck in their ways and not particularly innovative. And those are all stereotypes. And I really would like to see workplaces start to challenge those beliefs.
Yeah, Rachel, and I wonder if you've seen this. I've heard this from several consultants that work, friend of consultants that work in this space, especially around age. Excuse me. Which is that you also see a big difference when we talk about kind of age discrimination between women and males. Like there's a big difference in gap. Talk to that. Like, what is that about? What's going on there?
I don't have the answer to that, but look, all you got to do is look at George Clooney, right? I mean, what is he? He's in his 60s maybe, and he's still considered attractive and viable and successful. And you juxtapose that against an older actress, and they're past their prime, and they're grumpy and old and wrinkly. So we just have this, and I think that it is true for women, and I think it is the intersectionality, right, of being a woman and being someone who's older. Now you have two strikes against you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's such a good analogy with acting and just kind of that in Hollywood in general, because I think it's something that's visible that everyone can see. And when you think of Hollywood, even think about the roles that actors are cast in or have opportunity to play as they get older. For men, it really doesn't narrow the field. Like they can still play the love interest, they can still play the action star, they can still play kind of all the roles that were really available to them when they were younger. But to women, now it's like you get to play the grandmotherly role. That's the role that's available for you, and they never get to play the love interest or any of these other that were available when they're younger and are still available to their counterparts.
Yeah, and it was actually a big media interest in that when the new Top Gun movie came out. And I don't remember the actress's name, Kelly Willis, maybe, I don't know, and Tom Cruise. And of course, Tom Cruise looks great. But there was a lot of misogyny around what it is to look like a 50-year-old woman, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Yeah, I remember. That just reminds me of the Super Bowl this last year and Rihanna, and it was like a huge thing that was kind of going on. That was like people were like, "Do not shame Rihanna. Maybe she is, maybe she isn't. Should you make this comment? Should you not?" It was definitely at the epicenter of a pretty crazy conversation that people were having. It ended up that she was pregnant, but the question I think is still there of like, there's this immense pressure that had nothing to do with Rihanna killing it and being a great singer, and everything to do with how she showed up in her, in what she was wearing and how she looked in what she was wearing. When I'm pretty sure the year before, I think that was the Rockefellers that would like, all the rappers. They weren't in great shape. Like, let's be honest. Like, it wasn't like they showed up in six packs and were like looking great. But no one talked about that, did we? We just talked about how great of a performance it was.
Yes, yes. And I mean, since we're talking Super Bowl, what was it? The Shakira and J-Lo combination. But think about how much focus was on their bodies and how great they looked for their age.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just so much attention and conversation. And this is just true in our media. When I open up my Facebook, I have so many ads that are served up to me on how I can look younger and better for 50, and it's just something that we internalize, of course, and then
Mm-hmm.
it follows us into all areas of our lives, including the workplace.
That's such a good point. I think most people, and this is something that I think was hard for me to come to terms with, which was to understand some of the biases that I have against that exist in society against Black people. I also internalize. Like I see the same media, I see the same news that all the criminals are always Black people, or the phrasing is always like there was an actor who recently died, and I'm gonna forget his name, which I feel horrible about, but he was a Black actor. He died, and they said, in his title in the New York Times, they were like, I think it was like addict saved, who had a career is great, died unfortunately. And there was someone else who was like a white actor who also had a troubled past, let's say, and it was said beloved actor dies unexpectedly at 56. Like they didn't add all these extra terms to it, and I think those are the type of things that you don't realize we take note of, right, and we internalize as well. We have to do work on. So I think that's such a great point.
Yeah, and for those who haven't taken the Harvard Implicit Bias Assessment, I took it, and I expected, we all think we don't have that much bias,
Yeah.
but it turns out the area I was the most biased against, the population or demographic, was older people, more so than anything else. And I was shocked because,
Yeah.
I'm not yet, elderly, but, I'm a older, middle-aged woman, and I have a lot of bias towards myself.
Yeah. And I think it's such a good point too that you took it. Like I think what I really want listeners to take away from this, which is what Rachel just said, is like being aware of it is actually better than just making the assumption I don't have any biases. Like having those things and being aware of it, instead of, I think a lot of people are intimidated about it, or just make the assumption that, oh, I don't have any bias. Why would I need to take that test? Like, okay, take it and prove yourself right. At least then you know that you don't have any biases. But I think it's such an excellent point. But okay, so now we talked very theoretical. How do we then take this into organizations when we talk about them building diverse cultures, maybe even talent acquisitions, right? We know these biases exist out there. What can companies do in a very practical sense to try to remove bias from their selection or address bias potentially in their hiring managers?
So I want to kind of take a step back, and
Okay.
I think when we talk about DE&I, in a lot of organizations that I've been a part of, a lot of the onus for bringing in diverse, talent into an organization is with recruiting.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we have a huge role to play in that. But if the infrastructure isn't there, if the buy-in from the leaders that, hey, this is going to be an investment either in resources and money and time to be able to get diversity into our organization and retain that diversity, if that's not there, what recruiting is doing is going to be very performative, and the candidates are going to sniff that out, the employees are going to sniff that out, and your strategy is going to fail. And I'll give an example. At a company that I worked at, we actually had a head of diversity. We talked a ton about recruiting for diversity. We had KPIs or goals around how we were going to recruit for this diversity. And yet, when we had a company all hands, 95% of the presenters were white men. Most of the executive leadership was white men. So there's a lot of hypocrisy there, and it's very hard to hold on to your diverse talent or to recruit in new diversity when you're not acting on the values that you say you have.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, that didn't really quite answer your question, but I wanted to kind
No,
of.
no, I love this topic more than what I was saying. I don't know what he was saying, but I don't like the guy who said what I said before. He was not.
Okay.
He's stupid. I like this. I think this is actually such an important topic and something that is always missed, which is just to reiterate, companies oftentimes rely so heavily on recruitment that they miss the fact that people aren't staying. Like I see this all the time. I'm sure you do as well when you work with companies. That what happens is their recruiters are actually doing a fantastic job of bringing candidates in, but they're not staying. Usually we look at promotions, no women or people of color, the groups are bringing are getting promoted, period. Oftentimes it's a particular department that's making all these hires, but they're also making all these hires because they also have a very high turnover rate, which means we just have a revolving door. So what's going on with that leader? I think you're incredibly correct. And I can't agree with you enough that it's not just a recruitment. And oftentimes because it's easy, because we can understand the numbers and it feels like we're making progress there, there's a hesitation to focus almost too much on it and forget that like we really have to do the work. There is no easy way around it. You got to do the work. You got to engage. You got to work on retention. You got to work on representation.
And you have to have the buy-in from the most senior leaders, the people who are managing the budget, who are
Yep.
managing the strategy, because you can't just turn a light switch on when it comes to recruiting. You can't just say, all right, we need some more Black engineers. But you have the same amount of time to do this and the same resources. It's not going to be effective. You need to live your values and put your money where your mouth is. So hiring for diversity, it requires an investment of funds. So whether that is, investing in communities, internship programs, mentorship programs, the branding that you need to amplify, assuming you have a inclusive culture, amplify that messaging through, recruitment marketing activities. And then it takes time. A lot of time when you start a search, the most obvious candidates are going to be your white men, right? If you're looking for engineers, they're going to be your white men. And if you're in a time crunch, recruiters are going to put those candidates in first, and you're going to hire that white engineer. And so if you are committed to hiring for diversity, you have to invest the time and the money and the resources in that, and that comes from the top. Recruiting can't own that.
And I think what I love about that is the flip side of that is if you don't, you can't be surprised that it doesn't work. Because I always think about, I think it's Apollo 11, and they asked one of the senior engineers in NASA after Apollo 11, which I think is the one that exploded. I can't remember. I think that was it. But that's what I'm talking about. They talked to him about this ship that exploded, and they asked him, why did this happen? Why did this happen? And he basically said, well, one of the biggest reasons is they only started taking people from the same universities that had the same teachers that thought the same thing. And before, when they had people from all different universities, they would question each other. But instead, when they started all going this profession, they just agreed that's actually the correct formula and that's the right math for that, instead of questioning each other. And I think you can't be surprised when something doesn't take off, because it's a natural human thing that we want to hire from our network, from the people we know. And the people we know tend to look like us and have similar experiences. It's why we get along with them. It's why we're like, yeah, let's go hang out and do something. Like, you like snowboarding, I like snowboarding. You like golfing, I like golfing, and then it works out. So we have to be very intentional when we have a business, because we want that thought process to come from many perspectives, so we're not missing anything. So I love that. I think that's such an excellent point.
Well, and that there and lies the issue with referral programs, which can be a great source of hires for companies. So there is a time and place for that, but you have to be really intentional. I've been in situations where we had sort of like this gold mine where, somebody worked at a company that was going through a lot of change, and they were able to recruit all their buddies into this one team. And so then we have a team that has all very similar work experiences and perspectives. And then same thing for sort of that networking. A lot of times I've been in organizations, the internships go to the CEO's
Yeah.
neighbor's nephew, right?
Yep.
And they all, live in that gated community, or they are on that golf course. It's a
Yep.
lot of privilege in that
Mhm.
type of networking. And when you rely too heavily on that, um, don't be surprised when you have a lot of people that look the same.
And I think what I love, and this might help us get back to kind of inclusion in companies, is when we talk about inclusion, I think there's oftentimes a misunderstanding. I'd love to get your thought on this. I think for me, I think there's a misunderstanding of, a lot of people think inclusion means we don't argue, we don't fight, and nobody brings up any issues. There's no tension. And I think inclusion is the exact opposite of that. It's, I feel respected and the ability to share my opinion in the face of opposition. And I think that's really what we're looking for. And too often we have that close knit group, right? That group of people who came over from the other company, we're like, they have great inclusion, they all get along, and it's so fantastic. Well, actually, that's not what I want in a company. I want you to disagree and have, actual communication. So we're putting forward the best product, we're having the best processes. Because if no one disagrees, because I like you and I may kind of disagree, but I kind of like you, so I'll let you get away with this. It doesn't actually help us get to the best product. So I think that's such an excellent point.
Yeah, and I think when I really liked what you said, because I think when we talk about how do we train organizations to be inclusive and to have diverse workforces, we focus on things like unconscious bias and sourcing for diversity, all good things. But there's some foundational elements there, which are, how do you have difficult conversations? How do you communicate with people who have a different style of communication from you? How do you challenge people in an effective way, and live that value of respect and create that psychological safety for people? That's where a lot of that foundational training has to happen. And then you can layer on, unconscious bias and some of these other things.
I think that's such a good point. You have to have a way to monitor your own growth. Like, that's what I hear from that, is like, if you're, I think of allyship, right? I think of a lot of white males, male people on any spectrum, white women, everyone who's trying to support the other people around them and make sure they feel welcome and included. Part of the onus is on you, and part of that is really having an understanding of, what are you doing in meetings that could be doing it. Because I think sometimes, like, I might have a communication style that's just dominant in conversation. Like, I just want to get my idea out, and understanding like how my conversational style impacts everyone's conversation can help. Like, there might be a time and place for how I'd like to communicate, but also altering my communication style so other people, or also using it as support when someone might be being talked over or having their ideas stolen in a meeting, is actually a better use for the same skill that then also supports my colleagues, also supports better ideas. But I think that's such an excellent point.
It's something I definitely had to train myself, because if you haven't guessed it, I love to hear myself talk. I love to be the center of attention. And so, yeah, and like you, I get really excited and I can dominate the conversation. And as a leader, when I had recruiting teams, sometimes I became uncomfortable with silence. I would want to just jump in, and recognizing that people have different ways of processing information. Sometimes if you just let it sit, count to 10, someone else will join in. And so
Yes.
I think when we're talking about inclusion, we aren't just talking about, okay, well, we need to make sure that we include women in the conversation or people of color. It's everyone. It's people who have a diverse or different way of communication or comfort levels speaking up in a group, and how do we create different avenues for those people to have their ideas heard and their opinions shared.
That's such a good point. I know some of the most brilliant people are the people that comment in the chat but never say anything. Like they just have beautiful messages. Maybe they don't like public speaking, but I think it's so important to, I think, take the moment and say what's in the chat, so it's a part of the group. If that's how people prefer to communicate, I think that's so great. But I think one of the things that I want to zoom in there on is making mistakes. What that reminded me of is like, it was in a podcast. I literally made a mistake where I started a podcast. I had someone who had a disability, and I started by saying, oh, so and so, let's talk about people with disabilities, right? I assumed the term for the person I was having a conversation with, instead of asking the person, what term did you prefer? And so I just stopped the conversation, like, look, I am so incredibly sorry that I like assumed the term. What term do you actually? And it didn't dawn on me until we were in the conversation, and he used the term that I didn't, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. But he wasn't frustrated. He wasn't angry. He was actually thankful that like I stopped the conversation and was okay being embarrassed and being in the wrong to correct it. I think that is something that I don't see a lot of people doing it. What stories do you have of people who've made mistakes and done stuff like that?
Well, you're actually jumping ahead to my missing piece.
Okay.
What I think one of the missing pieces in our conversations as a society and as a company around DEI is fear. I think people are so afraid to make mistakes because topics around diversity are often politicized. We're a litigious society. And I think people are afraid to say the wrong thing. They're afraid to leave out a letter in LGBTQ. They're afraid, do I call somebody Black or do I call them African American? So they don't want to offend people. And because of this, we don't say things. Because of this, we don't have hard conversations. And this inhibits progress. And so I have my own story of a huge mistake, a very public mistake that I made in an organization that was incredibly mortifying and painful at the time, but had a nice outcome. So I was leading sort of a internal initiative on DE&I. We wanted to, it was a group of people who were excited about talking around diversity, and we thought we would do celebrate diversity for a month. And we would invite people through our organizations to come and share at our weekly all hands about their heritage, ethnicity, gender, whatever it is, and how it influenced their journey growing up and in their career, and anything that they wanted us to know about it. And we thought it'd be great to hear personal stories. So we threw it out there to the organization, and we literally got one volunteer. That volunteer happened to be a cis white male who wanted to talk about Christianity. And yes, I paused and was like, is this a good idea? And I went back to our little diversity committee, which also happened to be all white women. And we were like, okay, well, you know what? Inclusion means we include everybody. So let's hear from this individual. And he gave his presentation at the next all hands. And the feedback was fast and it was passionate. People were really confused how we could be touting celebrate diversity, and our first speaker was a white man talking about Christianity. Mm-hmm. They thought, does this organization not understand the challenges that marginalized communities have in the workplace, in their lives? They weren't comfortable with the topic of Christianity. And people were mad and they were hurt, and we heard about it. I felt really badly that I'd hurt people, and I thought my career was over. I really did. It was a terrible experience. But what happened was I started to have conversations with the people who were giving feedback and who were impacted, and listening, and honestly being super open about the fact that I screwed up. And maybe it wasn't a great idea to have a group of white women leading, like that all look the same, leading our diversity initiatives. And that we don't know everything. We aren't, we all want to appear like experts, but, there's so much I don't know, and I have so much to learn. And there were some very real conversations, not just between me. It really inspired conversations across the entire organization. It did inspire more people to share their stories. And I think it was out of that was the most authentic conversations we've had around DEI. It was painful, but I actually ultimately think that it pushed us forward. And so we have to give each other grace,
Mm-hmm.
give ourselves grace, give others grace to make those mistakes, but learn from them and change their behaviors as a result.
Yeah, Rachel, I think that's such a special story for a couple of reasons. Number one, you're incredibly special. I think it's very rare to have someone who can authentically be in this space of like, I'm sorry, authentically, I am sorry. And how can I make this right? Because it's one thing to be authentically sorry, right? Because a lot of people are authentically sorry because it makes them uncomfortable. Not very many people are authentically sorry like you are, Rachel, which is like, I'm sorry because it hurt you, and how can I make it right? I think that's something that is crucial to the situation. Like, and I think it's good for our listeners to know it's okay to make mistakes. In fact, you're going to make mistakes. That's going to happen. That is inevitable. But you have to be able to not try to take away people's right to be angry, right to be frustrated, and meet them where they're at and try to move forward from that. And just you can only control yourself, right? And the grace, I think that's such a great story.
One of the most poignant pieces of feedback I got was when I was talking to a woman who was, upset about this. I said, well, this wasn't my intention. Like, I was just trying to do something good. And she said, it doesn't matter what your intention was. What matters was the outcome. And that's really hard to take because you want to be like, I'm a good person. I really was trying to do something great. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
What matters is the outcome and the impact. And so what matters is you're changing your behavior and looking for a different outcome next time.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point. And just to use a completely oversimplistic analogy, if we're two kids on a playground and you keep kicking me down the slide, right? And you're like, I'm sorry, I'm still a good person. I don't care. You keep kicking me down the slide, right? Like at some point, I'll believe you're a good person when you stop kicking me down the slide, right? And so I think that's part of it. You got to understand it's not necessarily like your words can't change it, your actions have to. Your actions as an organization have to speak louder than the words that you're speaking. Like I think so many times, especially in Mars-like communities, they have been taken advantage of so often and heard so many hollow promises that it doesn't mean anything. Like it doesn't mean anything that you feel like you're a good person and you feel like you would never do this. It matters that you make the change. And Rachel, I think that's the part I love the most about your story is that there was change after that. There was an examining and a changing of like, okay, probably not a great idea to just have white women a part of this. Like we're diverse on a gender level, but there are some things here that probably don't make sense that we need to be able to have those perspectives in the room. So
Another very interesting thing that came out of this, and this was an observation, and I don't have an answer for this, but it was more easy for us as because we had asked for other participants, right? We had asked for other people to be part of our diversity committee, and to participate. But there is a certain level of privilege and comfort that we had being white, um, you know, and actually most of us in more senior level positions
mhm.
leading these initiatives. And when I asked people why they didn't want to join, why weren't they part of our group? I spoke with one Black man who was like, I'm tired. This was in the height of George Floyd as well. I'm tired. I think about this all day long. I don't want to think about this at work.
Yeah.
And there's a lot on the line for me to come up and share my story. There's more risk involved for me than it is for you or this white man who talked about Christianity.
Mhm.
And so that was really poignant, and it really gave me pause. And that leaves me the question: how do you get people involved? How do you have diversity of thought when you're planning these type of activities or when you're trying to develop your diversity, equity, inclusion strategies?
I think back to even like just my experience as a student, and anytime anything, is civil rights, everyone in the class turns to you. And so, like for your entire life, like people just turn to you when anything and you have to be an expert and a representation for the entirety of the Black community, which I think is unfair and not right. And no one can actually be a representative for the entirety of the Black community. But I think to your question, when people are looking at that, obviously we won't have the answer, but we'll theorize about it a little bit. But I think part of what helps is you have to be willing to start. You can't ask those people to step up right now. It goes back to being present, not perfect, right? I feel like if leaders are constantly putting themselves in situations where, believe it or not, you're being embarrassed, right? Because you did something wrong or you wish you would have done it differently, but you consistently come back and say, I'm so sorry, let's try it this way. And you mess up again, fine. But people see that. They know, like, okay, he's not going to quit. She's not going to quit. They keep showing up. And that, I think, is what people will say, okay, if you show up, I'll show my, I may be tired, but because you keep showing up, I'll show up. And I think that's what people forget is when we talk about being present, not perfect. It's about the consistency of being present. Anybody can show up for a month. Anybody can show up once a year to say, hey, look, I care. It's hard to show up every single week and every single day to say, hey, stop talking over people. Like I'm noticing a pattern here. You keep talking over women. I am going to be a thorn in your side until you change your behavior. And that's really what it means to be an ally. It's not a passive, it's an active. It's like you gotta engage here. So I think that's such a good question. Not that I have a great answer for it, but I think that'd be my thought on it. But
Well,
yeah.
you made me think of something else. And one of the topics I know we might talk about today was training for diversity.
Yeah.
And so often, I think companies will invest a ton of money. They'll hire an outside consultant. Everybody will go through unconscious bias training. We'll all get a certificate. Yay, right? And then it might impact things for a short period of time. We might see some positive changes, but then it's over. And we might
Mhm.
not go through that training again for another year, another 2 years,
Yeah.
and we don't continue the conversation. And so I think that uh, companies get caught up in it. And again, it might be good intentions,
Yeah.
might just be performative. You have
Yeah.
to continue to have those conversations. It's not just a one-time, let's do the diversity thing, and now we've done it, and we're all good. Let's move on.
Yeah, that just reminded me of one of the fads of diversity that came in and kind of went. I think it's still kind of around to an extent, but there was this kind of proficiency in diversity. Like you're at level 3 at understanding what it means to be Black in the Black. And it to me, it just spoke of like a really condescending effort of like, can you ever really understand what it means to be Black? And is that the point? Is that the like? And I think when you think about it, like you never get to the end of the road. It's constantly practicing a muscle that we as a society have gotten out of, which is like having uncomfortable conversations and really trying to understand your fellow human being in the best way we can. And that means you're going to make mistakes. Like you're going to say things and you're not going to agree, but you have to try to be respectful, which is something we already do with our close friends that we disagree with. But it's something we need to extend to everyone and be able to have those conversations. But it's such a good point. I love that. Well, I want to talk. I know we're running close on time here, but what what can a company do when we look at diversity and inclusion, talent acquisition, creating inclusive cultures, and training? What's the tip that you have for them, or what are like the 3 top things that they can do to really kind of take their programs to the next level?
Yeah. Um, Again, I sound like a broken record, but we want to make sure that this is supported at the very top of the organization and start there because everything kind of trickles down. The behaviors that are rewarded in an organization, the accountability, it will end up coming from the top. So you need to make sure that there is an alignment around what are our expectations? How do we define diversity? What values do we have that embody diversity? And then again, how do we reward those behaviors and how do we hold people accountable? So that infrastructure, putting that infrastructure in place first is so important. Um, I think I've definitely gone in organizations where they have these slick training modules. You do it online by yourself. You get the certificate at the end. And there's a place for that. But I
Mhm.
think we need to have it be more of an open dialogue with individuals. We need to invite people to question each other, to in that safe environment, to ask questions, to practice their skills, to hear real life stories from individuals. So I think that is what I feel is the most important, hearing the real stories, providing the framework that this is important to us. This is what's going to be rewarded, and this is where we're going to hold you accountable.
I think that's such a good point. I think if you had to learn math, but you never got to practice math, you wouldn't be very good at math, would you? Right? Like you would just like, theoretically, two integers can go into each other.
Right.
You could read that as many
Don't talk
times
to me
as you
about
want. Exactly, right? It's like, oh, like if you never practice it, there's no way. But that is fantastic. This is kind of along the same lines, but it's a question we always like asking all of our guests, which is when we talk about diversity of inclusion, it just feels like there's a missing piece. We know there's more than one. You kind of shared it earlier. Would you mind recapping for us, just for our listeners, what you feel like the missing piece is in diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I think it's that psychological safety. I think it's allowing people to not be experts. Leaning in to the I don't know the right way, I don't know the right behavior necessarily, and I want to learn, and I'm going to try, and I'm going to keep trying, and when I make a mistake, I'm going to own the mistake, and I'm going to change the behavior. But if we operate in a space of fear of doing the wrong things, of getting sued, it doesn't mean there's not a time and place to get sued, but of offending somebody, you kind of have to accept you might offend somebody. Mm-hmm. And it's how you behave after that. It's how you change your behavior. It's how you approach that individual to continue to keep growing. And I think it's just so key that we get people in that psychological safety zone and out of that space of fear if we want to make progress, in real meaningful progress in this work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think you gotta engage. You can't sit on the sidelines. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being on the show today. What do you have coming up? How can people find out more about you, and how can they work with you if they want to?
Well, I am a incredibly active LinkedIn content producer, so please reach out to me. I love networking with other people who are passionate about DE&I. So, send me a invitation. I am providing fractional talent acquisition, leadership, and strategy, mostly with small, mid-sized businesses who are going through periods of scale or might not have the infrastructure in place. Love to do that work, as well as I love to speak with other organizations about their diversity, equity, and inclusion, and particularly on the topic of ageism. So invite me to come speak with you.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being on the Finding Diversity, the Missing Piece podcast. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in again. And we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.